Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to the Golden Globes. I don't know if you guys recognize this. This is a different setup than last year, and I do like it. It's kind of a little bit boozy, you know. But we are all sober, right? Yeah, Tom? Yeah, good. Thanks for coming, and I'm pleased to welcome Tom, Valerie, and David to this panel on Huron Histories. I'm from Middlesex County, from small town Middlesex County, which is fairly landlocked. I'm sure all of us have been to Middlesex County. There's the Antler River goes through Middlesex and the Y Creek, and there's a couple of small things, but the beautiful, gigantic lake, the Lake Huron, is I might be speaking just for myself, but it's always been quite a mystery. You know, we would go to the shoreline, we would see this gorgeous, beautiful thing, but being mainly from farm fields and tiny little villages, this beautiful lake was a bit mysterious to me. So I'm very excited to talk to these three folks who have all written about that area of the world one way or another, personally, just to find out more about how it has influenced them as writers, poets, novelists, and historians. So I think I'm just going to ask each of you to quickly introduce yourselves and maybe give us good folks a bit of background about what you do. Valerie.
I am Valerie Mills-Milde, and in addition to writing, I'm also a clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and have been in the city for decades practicing. My last two novels were historical fiction, one set primarily in Bruce County, just around the time of the First War, and this last book set over the days of the Great Storm of 1913, which really devastated the entire shoreline and communities along the shoreline at that time. So that's me.
David.
My name is David Plain. I come from Amjanong. It's a reserve that's it's a part of the city of Sarnia. I'm an author and a poet and a historian. I've published 8 books. I've published 4 nonfiction history books. It's all Aboriginal history from the Great Lakes. And I've published 1 historical fiction, which is a novel, and I published 2 poetry books and 1 memoir. Does that add up to 8, I hope? So I'm going to be reading from short passages from 4 of my books today. And that's me.
Thank you. And Tom, you're from Huron County, are you not?
Yeah, grew up kind of between Goderich and Wingham, about 20 minutes from the lake at Amberley. RR1 Belgrave was the our address. And I now live here. I teach creative writing at Western. I work at the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority as well as a community partner specialist. And I run a little group called Antler River Rally, and we do monthly cleanups of Dashkan ZB, which we can see here from where we're sitting. And my partner Miriam and I started that group 11 years ago, doing monthly cleanups, 1 a month. And over 11 years, that need has just grown and grown and grown. This year, we're on track to do 18 cleanups of the river before the end of the. Oh, thanks. Yeah. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, well, my partner and I, Vanessa, we're at home in our pajamas, eating cereal and drinking coffee on Sunday mornings. Tom is out doing the actual work to clean up the world, essentially. So, and however, I say that, but I've never ever gone out to help him. So
There's always a first time.
there's always a first time. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. I have a 6-month-old. She's up there, and if you hear any squawks or squeaks, it's not the microphones. It's that little human being up. Yeah, it's Vanessa. It's my wife. I'm personally very interested in why people choose to write about particular places. Even if we come from somewhere, that we all come from somewhere, of course, but as writers and artists, not everybody chooses to write about the place that they're from, right? Or even if they're not from that place, let's say you're not from Huron or along the shores of Huron, this area of the world has fascinated each of you in one way or another. And I think it's a very particular and at times courageous choice, even as an author, to take a place that isn't necessarily internationally renowned, although the Great Lakes are, of course, but it doesn't have the pizzazz of, New York or, I don't know, Markham or something like that. To choose to put all of your creative, or a whole lot of your creative energies into that particular place, and then to dig even deeper, not only find a personal relationship, but also a relationship that you'll invite your readers to have as well. So I'm interested in knowing from each of you, why this place? What was it that drew you personally to write about it and to spend that much time alone working on a story or history or a collection of poems that relate to it? Valerie?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that because I was not born in those counties that are shoreline counties. The Great Lakes have always held a huge resonance for me, and I grew up sailing on the Great Lakes, but I think it's more than that. And when I consider it, these are essentially inland seas, and yet they're not, right? No matter how large and vast they are conscribed. They're limited by shoreline. And in that way, for me, they really kind of reflect human experience, that there's this vastness of experience, of feeling, of memory. But it is, but there are limitations, very real limitations, and that's shoreline. And I think the other part is they really convey this kind of tension, water and land, right? I mean, you've got all this farmland, you've got settlement, and then you've got these, these undeniable large bodies of water. And I, like a lot of writers, that's where I find the interest, right, is in the tension. Mm-hmm. And in the personal human stories those call forth for me in terms of imagining stories. So long answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
A good one. Thank you. David.
I said I was from Aamjiwnaang. That's today. It's a small reserve, about 3,200 acres. But in our culture, our lands were really huge before we began ceding it all off. So when I think culturally, and someone asks me, where do you come from? I just say, the Great Lakes Basin. And that's basically what I write about. I write about our history in the Great Lakes Basin from maybe 1600 up through the war, 1812. That's kind of what I like to write about. Yeah, so that includes Lake Huron, of course.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Yeah.
Tom, what about you? Why choose that location to focus your creative efforts?
Yeah, after I wrote my first book, which is really grounded, I think, more here in London, I started kind of looking back home, and I think I was ready. You know, you need to kind of be away from home. Home is only something that you kind of come to after you've been cast out of it, or left in a way. And so I was ready to kind of start thinking about, you know, my upbringing in this pretty idyllic patch of East Wawanosh Township, along a river called the Maitland River, or the Manassatung River, or the Red River. And at the same time, as I was thinking about that, and thinking about starting to write about my dad, who died quite suddenly when I was 26, this was also the time when the Truth and Reconciliation report had just come out, which I think for a lot of people, a lot of settlers, people from settler ancestry, it was a real shock, and not so much a shock at the same time. But, you know, I was looking at this history of growing up in East Wawanosh Township, going to East Wawanosh Public School, not knowing what Wawanosh meant. We weren't taught that in public school, what, you know, who Wawanosh was. And at that time, I think I reached out. David was having a treaty workshop at Amjanaw, and I reached out and said, "Can I come?" And he said, "Sure," and told me what to bring, and that's when I first met David. And so this investigation of home has been also an unsettling of home for me, and kind of becoming aware of this history that is there, that we were never taught, and that I wanted to learn about so that I could understand really what home meant. So that's kind of a little bit about Huron and this book.
There are some poems in your book, of course, that deal with that. Am I right?
Yeah.
Would you read one of them to us?
Yeah. So, you know, David has a book with him today, A Brief History of the Saugeen Peninsula. And that I read that book while I was thinking about what it would mean to have a land acknowledgement as a poem, and also about where I came from. And David was kind enough to look at earlier versions of this poem and invited me down to his property, and we drove around Sarnia and had French fries under the bridge and just kind of talked. So this poem has kind of come out of that, and it was written at Point Clark. And if you're in Point Clark, looking out across Lake Huron, you'll see, you won't see it, but Alpena, Michigan is on the other side. And there was a giant land bridge across from Point Clark to Alpena about 10,000 years ago. And that's when First Peoples came across and came to the shores of, and on those shores are, well, I won't over-explain it. I'll read the damn poem. So this is called Treaty 45 and a half. There's a long footnote about how Treaty 45 and a half came into being based on David's research. Basically, in the 1840s, government of Canada coerced the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation of peoples to sign a treaty that was based on a promise that the whole rest of the Saugeen Peninsula would be left untouched and would be sovereign Ojibwe territory forever. And no sooner was that treaty signed that the government then started going after that patch of land as well. And that those are still before the courts. So Treaty 45 and a half. Contend with 10,000 years, the lake once so low, a land bridge stretched from here to Alpena. Boulders drowned by rising waters mark places paleo hunters corralled caribou crossed from the north, stepping onto this beach, throwing forward loops of time and relation. Now the beach is waterlogged, nearly gone. A red balloon snarls in tree roots lapped by the surf. Waves paint dull stones, churn froth, broken shells, cigarette butts, I find a green plastic figure, headdress, bare chest, moccasins, expressionless, made in China. In another handful of sand, an empty cap gun cartridge, the kind we bought as kids. Flashing badge, quick draw, we laid down the law and reloaded, killed each other in a clap of sulfur and smoke before lunch. My rural ruins, crop tours, mineral moonlight, smelt runs, beached sturgeon. July bonfires burned our school notes, other histories and geographies, ours the bored drone of Upper and Lower Canada, Wolfe and Montcalm lulling us into daily disremembering, sitting high in a tractor cab, blasting country, hydraulics and steel, turning the soil below. When news broke, Oka, Ipperwash, we gathered up the silence we had planted and stuffed our ears with seeds. Each spring, the frost shouldered up stones we loaded on wagons and dumped in the swamps. Thousands of feet beneath this lake, massive machines claw at walls of salt. No end to what we'll dig up or try to bury. The land breaks through the map of it. It's all caught here between the call and response of sandbar and dune. I want to wait here until the sturgeon return, smelt, run, plovers brood, until I am blasted into beach glass. Thank you.
So in reading all three of your books and in preparation for this, it struck me how I was curious about the different approaches that each of you might take to your subject matter. In particular, research, and then sort of putting everything together, sort of cohering everything in book form. In particular, I was thinking about yours, of course, David, which is a fantastic history. I'm going to ask each of you this question. So this is for all three of you. Valerie and David, you must have sort of spent a lot of time in archives and, speaking to people in the community. This is me just guessing, sort of trying to, work back to see how you got to what you got to. But I was wondering if the three of you could talk about, Valerie first, about sort of archival research and sort of how you prepared to write this book, because it's filled with historical detail.
I love that part of writing, and I certainly do use archives a lot. I particularly love old news clippings, diaries, but physical objects are really resonant as well. And then speaking to people, I was fortunate to connect with a number of people who had written about the Great Storm, written about the early 20th century and freighters and the commercial activity on the lakes. And some of the stories, some of the personal connections just really add the tone and the believability to the novel. So I think you cast your net wide, and you sort of get these little nuggets, and somehow they really help inform how the whole thing kind of hangs together.
Writing about place is a very difficult thing, I've found, and because it's so focused, and finding local detail today, I found, is more difficult than, say, 20 years ago. A lot of archives are being defunded. For example, I recently found out that a librarian, I won't name who, but they had the extraordinary news clipping files. Like, just a librarian had put together this wonderful filing cabinet filled, subject organized local history from the local papers. And the head of that library or that department wanted to throw all of that stuff out, thinking that it's all available on the internet. But of course, only 10% of the world's information is available on the internet. An extraordinary amount of local history was saved by one nice old librarian who sat there and physically cut out her local paper, right? And anything. There was Boy Scout tree planting down one concession road, and there's a picture of the Boy Scouts to the Women's Auxiliary, having a quilting competition or something like that. Anyway, I could go on about this forever. I'm interested in sort of your experience with archives, and once you have all that information, how do you then build? Because the characters in your book are fictional, am I right? But
Largely. The captain of the Carruthers actually was really the captain of the Carruthers.
Right.
Captain Wright, yeah.
How did you, as a novelist, take all this great original primary research and build something fictional from that?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that the story sort of grows itself, right? As you collect all this information, as a fiction writer, characters just kind of walk into your consciousness, and you kind of get curious, and you kind of want to follow where they're going. And the research around the storm, and not just the storm, but in this book, I've had to do a lot of research about mink farming and about, how does a lake freighter actually work and what does it look like? And as you're building that framework and that architecture, the characters kind of move in, and they kind of take up space, and you start giving them voice, and you just kind of follow them. So yeah.
Now, Tom was raving about the mink farming section of your book to me last night, actually, standing out in front of the museum. And this is the first time I've ever heard someone rave about mink farming. And
it's a bit dark.
But it's marvelous.
It's a little bit dark.
It's a bit ghastly, isn't it? And so that excites me. So I was wondering if you would read that section. I think Tom would be very excited to hear about it laugh.
So this section that I'll read a little bit from, the story really hangs on, it's a father and son story, and they are estranged from one another. And the son is a deckman on the James Carruthers, which really was a Great Lakes freighter that went down in the Great Storm. And the father is Connor Darling, who is desperately trying to make his failing mink farm, survive another season. And this story really does unfold over the 4 days of the Great Lakes storm, but there are flashbacks to earlier times. So I'll just give you a little bit. Connor did the culling himself, remembering that his own father had spared him the awful specter of shooting a sheep that was sick with bloat. The killing of mink is a terrible task. Connor wrung the creatures' necks, his hands protected from their snapping and biting in a pair of thick gloves. There had been a merciful surge of relief as one after the other the sinewy bodies grew limp. But later, while skinning the animals and preparing the pelts, he'd felt ashamed for how the animals in life had unnerved him, as though they had dug through his center and left a hole, black and sad and close to unbearable. Except for the mating pairs, the cages were always empty after a cull, but they soon filled. Again and again the animals procreated, even long after Harry was gone. Now Connor casts his eye over the land around him, all humps and scrub. It's a useless tract, too mean for livestock and not worth the work it requires for clearing. What is it good for if not for the mink? He's asked himself that question again and again. There is a dearth of possibilities, or at least he's myopic in that respect, peering at his horizon as if through an unshakable funk. Besides, he isn't fully free to decide about the farm, which is only partly his. Half of the ownership had come to his late wife, Essie, through her mother's family, and half had gone to Essie through her brother, Ed. When they'd first come, he and Essie stood in the yard, Connor giving a desultory try at the water pump, the handle coming away in his hand, and leaving him with a deeply angled sliver. The place hadn't been worked in decades. We'll sell it. Connor's gaze hardened. We can live better in town. Essie pulled a blanket around the baby's head to protect him from the knife-edged wind. Harry was asleep, his cheeks flushed pink, his lips forming a tiny whistle. I'd need Eddie's okay to do that. I'm sure he won't sell. Ed was mining around Sudbury, where Connor assumed he was drinking himself to death, all the while indulging the pipe dream of a softer life in his home county, growing apples or raising chickens. Essie looked at Harry, her face full up with love for him, everything she wanted there in her arms. If you won't let us out of it, we'll make a go. It's not bad here, Connor. But it was bad, at least for him, having years before fled his childhood place and home, Darling Farm, a sheep operation east of Cornwall that, in his mind's eye, was not so different from here. Not by the time he'd left it. He ruefully gazed at Essie's inheritance, the scrub, the hollowed-out house, the rotting sheds and tangled orchards, all of it producing a nervous echo in him, yet a weary sense of return. You will tell Ed you are going to sell. I won't shovel up someone else's shit, Essie. His tone had been rougher than he intended, and Essie held the baby closer. She looked down at Harry and smiled distractedly. Fine, I'll try, but he'll say no. She'd written, but it took a long time for Ed to respond, and the letter he sent was rambling and sop-filled. Connor was sure Ed had been drunk when he wrote it. In the end, he'd written that it was his home, that he wanted to hold on to it, and they didn't have the money to buy her out. You won't see Ed again, Essie, Connor prophesied, disgusted, tossing Ed's letter into the stove. He'll die before he comes back here. But it was Essie who died soon after Harry turned 3, and Connor was left little better than a caretaker for a scrappy piece of land he didn't want.
Now I'm going to get back to that. I'm going to get back to the storm of 1913, which is, of course, the sort of romantic thrust of your book. But I will get there, I promise, because I know David has something that relates to it very well. But before I do that, I just want to finish off the line of inquiry regarding research, because David, your books take place over hundreds of years, and that fascinates me. How do you go about researching the history of an area over such a large period of time?
Well, you mentioned archives. I haven't done a lot of research actually in archives. When I lived in Toronto, I did a little bit of the U of T archives and the United Church archives. But most of my research is done online. There's so much out there, you can do it all online. Just Google it. And some of the resources that I found most useful would be like Wisconsin Historical Society have a 40-volume set, collection of historical records, reports, things like that. And 3 of those volumes, which are about 1,000 pages each, contain the historical records from the French regime of North America. So there's so much there. So there's that kind, as well as the Michigan Historical Society, Pioneer Society. They have the same amount of material for Michigan. And I also like history books written by historians from the 19th century. Especially in my own area. There's a couple from St. Clair County, Michigan, which is just across the river, St. Clair River from Sarnia. So I found a lot of information in there on my own family because there was a reserve in Port Huron at one time, and the author of this was a friend of my grandfather's. So he got a lot of oral stories from him and put it in the book.
Fantastic.
And a lot of it's oral stories, too, that aren't in the written record at all. So those are some of the main places that I've collected my information.
Can you
And then-
recommend? Oh, sorry.
Then to put it all together, was that what you're going to ask?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
To put it all together, it's basically chronological. And you just have to put together what was going on at the time. It fits like a jigsaw puzzle. And it's just one story after the other. So you're moving from basically for the 400 years, it seemed to be one war after the other. It just bounced from war to war. I come from a long line of chiefs, war chiefs. And we fought in all of the wars that are in the written record, in the historical books that are, written and studied in Western society. So that's how I put it together, I guess.
I think it was J.B. Priestley who said that history is just one bloody thing after another. But there's a storytelling element to it as well. Like the parts of your book that that I truly enjoyed were the parts about recreation and games and sort of.
Yeah, one of the first two books I wrote at the same time.
Okay.
And one is called Plains of Amjanong, Our History. That's a play on words because of the long line of chiefs. Eventually they became Plains, is a surname. And the other book was The Ways of Our Grandfathers, Our Traditions and Culture. So one's about culture, one's about history.
Are there a couple of books you can recommend about the history of this side of Lake Huron?
The Plains is good. It's probably my most popular book, the first one I wrote.
Okay.
The Plains of Amjanong. Yeah. And the one on Saugeen is popular as well.
And you've written a poem about the storm of 1913. Am I right?
Yes, I did.
Would you read that for us?
Sure. This comes from my first collection of poems, and it's called Poems from an Eclectic Mind. The poem's called The Witch of November. Do you remember the days of November? A wild Wiccan brew in 1913. The witch was born, do you remember? That white hurricane whose parents did whir, like wedding dance twirled a king and a queen. Do you remember the days of November? Clipper and low churned waves out in anger. From crest to trough, 3 stories between, the witch was born, do you remember? All good men sailed smooth in September, found watery graves that day all unseen. Do you remember the days of November? November gale, its color was amber. Freshwater fury lashed beaches obscene. The witch was born, do you remember? Big blow blew 4 days, low pressure's daughter. Big ships like toy boats, capsized, unforeseen. Do you remember the days of November? The witch was born, do you remember?
So this storm, I hadn't read too much about it, and I did some reading before this. Of course, Valerie's book deals with it quite a bit, but how many folks know about the storm of 1913? Yeah, there you go. There you go. It was awful. It was absolutely terrible. This is a great book here if you're looking for some history of the area. This is Boston Mills Press. Any book by Boston Mills Press is worth your time. But I learned from here that 235 people died and over 40 vessels sank. This was just over, what, a 2-day period?
Technically a 4-day period, but the worst of it was condensed on that Sunday. That's when most of the big freighters went down.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was reading this book actually the other day and looking out my window, and it was just dreadful outside. And the storm happened in November, of course. Am I right? So basically, imagine today you're hanging out, and then one of the worst storms for the region comes through and destroys houses, farms, an entire shoreline. The cryptic image, of course, is
Communication systems too,
communication.
right?
Yeah. And there are just bodies littered along the shoreline of Lake Huron. Am I right? Yeah. And captain's logs, ships. This is a Robinson Crusoe situation where everything just sort of yeah. How did you reckon with that when you were writing the book? How horrible it was. I mean, it's an attractive subject in some ways, but it's also a ghastly subject.
I certainly looked at a lot of photographs that were in newspapers from the time of the wreckage that came up along the shorelines. And there are some fantastic photographs of ships that were caught out in that storm and somehow made it back. And the ice accretion is beyond what you can imagine. I mean, six inches of ice covering these entire ships, and they were big ships. The ship that I write about was 550 feet, which is a lot in a metal hull. So a lot of it was visual. I mean, as I kind of immersed myself in visual images from the storm, and then would observe the water on kind of wild days and try to imagine waves that were 3 stories high, the size of a bank building as they were referred to at the time, 40-foot waves. And the snow, right? That's the part that was, these captains were, and wheelsmen were navigating blind. They couldn't see shoreline. Lighthouses were blown. So they were really, really out there alone, cut off from any communication. Pretty terrifying. So a lot of it was visual, I think, for me. And there is sort of a theme of isolation in the book anyway. So it kind of resonated around that for me, I think. Yeah.
Wasn't the wind coming this way and the waves were going that way? Like, it was
Yes.
just like a topsy-turvy
Yeah.
world.
There's a special wave action on the lakes, which I couldn't really explain to you now, but at the time I sort of understood it when I was writing the book. But it's very unique to the Great Lakes. And in this particular storm, it's what we might refer to today as a weather bomb. It was 3 different fronts colliding in a cyclonic event over the Great Lakes Basin, and it kind of stalled. So where most of these storms, like the one around the Edmonds Fitzgerald and ones that we know, would have blown out in 6 to 8 hours, this one had hurricane force winds on and off for 4 straight days, which you can imagine. I mean, even the railway going down to Sarnia, I believe, there was a derailment and casualties from that just because of the snow and ice on the tracks. It was devastating. It truly was devastating. Yeah.
Tom, you write about another kind of storm, another great storm, family history, which can be equally devastating at times. How do you go about, this is my question to you, how do you go about choosing, of all the things that you've experienced in relation to the place of Huron, but also the people that you've known in your family, how do you go about choosing what to write about?
I think by going home, driving those rural roads, and just being there, the memories come to you. And, I knew that I wanted to write a poem about my father. I didn't know really how to do it. Going home to this property that we sold about 10 years after he died, I kept driving by this property. This property was turned into an outdoor marijuana grow-op after we sold it.
My
So-
public school is now a marijuana grow up. Yeah, that's weird.
and this was before legalization. So there were big gates and keep out signs and unfriendly German Shepherd that wandered, and so it was interesting to kind of like be in this place and wanting to go into this home that was no longer my home, and thinking about like trespassing and how do you trespass into your own home, and just so being in that place and introducing my partner Miriam to Huron County. She's from Ohio, and now we spend all of our time that we have on holiday up at the lake. Anyway, so that's there. It's haunting. They're the ghosts haunt, and that's where they are. So to go there, that's where I find them.
I'm going to turn it over to questions now with a little bit of time that we have left. But before we do that, I just want to thank each of you for, each in a granular way, researching the history of a particular place. Because these things, as we heard, they do vanish. There will always be the Carlyles, there will always be the Parkers who try to create some grand narrative of a nation or a people. And my heart always lies in what's it like on a mink farm? What's it like to be out on the lake? What's it like to find out that your childhood home has been turned into a marijuana grow op? Like these histories, I personally feel are the most important because they are filled with extraordinary particular detail, and that details reflected in all three of your works. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to read all of them. Now that I've embarrassed you, I'm going to turn the event over to questions. We have a few minutes left. Does anybody have any questions for the three talented people on the stage? Sir.
Hi, I'm Mike from the Village Bookshop in Bayfield. So we now carry Valerie's book.
Oh.
So you can get that there. We have a bunch of David Plain's books, and he sells 1 million of them. He did a walking tour with the Trail Association a couple of years ago, and everybody came in and bought his books, which was great. And Tom,
Car.
okay, I guess we got to have a look at your book.
Yeah.
My question is, what does Wamanash stand for?
Are you asking the interpretation of Wewanash? Yeah, the interpretation. Well, there are a couple of them. One is a brave sailor, and the other one is a bad egg. I found those during my research. I ran across those interpretations.
And who was Wawanash?
Wewanash was a chief. Yeah, I was always taught to pronounce it Wewanash. I grew up knowing Wewanash. He was a very prominent chief. During the War of 1812, he was a warrior from Amjinong. And after the War of 1812, but before the Huron Tract Cession Treaty, he became a chief. And he was a chief until the 1870s. Very prominent. His name's around Lambton County quite a bit on different places and buildings and stuff.
What was the name of your bookstore again? Village Bookshop. Who here has been to the Village Bookshop? Very good. Yes. As a bookseller, I want to say opening up a bookstore is almost as courageous as writing a book. And my heart goes out to you. Does anybody else have a question? Yes, David.
I guess I won't introduce myself.
Small town.
Yeah, Jason's a mind reader. So what is my question, Jason? So they often say history is bound to repeat itself, and I wonder, as individuals who dig through archives, you're more apt to possibly see a events that maybe have repeated themselves or maybe are prone to be repeating themselves? Have you ever found anything or have insight for us along those lines?
Absolutely. I thought a lot about that while I was writing this book. I mean, the claim was, basically we didn't see it coming, but there were warning signs, there were warning flags. For me, in this time of climate crisis, I think there's all kinds of lessons to be learned from that that natural calamity that happened on the lakes, and it was just it was so much bigger than anybody could have imagined. And I think we're seeing more and more of those at regular intervals now. And we always say the same thing. We weren't prepared for it. So yeah, absolutely. With the Great Storm, I think that's true.
Well, yeah, history repeating itself. I'm in terms of writing about family and writing about my dad, and now being a dad, I'm thinking a lot about how family histories can repeat themselves, don't repeat themselves, and so I'm thinking about that. I think a lot of the book also has a lot of what you're talking about, Val, in terms of thinking about ecology and our relationships to the natural world and the history of colonialism and resource extraction is part of that too. But then woven into that for me is also the personal histories of my relationships, being the son to a father and now being a father to a son. So those two things kind of are front of mind.
Do you have an answer, Dave?
I certainly saw that in the writing of my history, because like I said before, we seem to bounce from war to war to war, and it was just again and again and again, just history repeating itself. So in my writings, you see that as well. But modern times, I don't see any uprisings on the horizon.
I have a question for you. Are we in the climate crisis in here along the Thames? Are we well positioned to deal with this, or should we all be moving to Manitoulin Island? Tom?
Well, as an employee of the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, whose special mission is to protect people and property from flooding,
Indeed.
through watershed measures,
Yes.
improving our watershed, building more low-impact development, bringing our wetlands back as natural sponges, all those things. Yes, we are, that the West London Dike is right there because of the multiple floods. That's how the authority came into being. That's how authorities came into being in Ontario, was after these devastating floods that lots of people lost lives. And of course, we are going to see more, of these extreme weather events, and we're going to see that expressed in our waterways. And there's lots and lots and lots we can do about that. But we need to be working on it because yes, we've seen floods here where that water is pretty far up the dike. Right?
Yeah,
I know you're in Blackfriars, so you're thinking about that.
Yeah, and if I recall, a lot of folks in the neighborhood didn't want that dike to be built. Like they didn't want that wall. Like, oh, we don't want the construction. It's just we're gonna keep us up at, wake us up in the morning. And then the year after it was built, I think the water went like this far up to the top, and then the mood in the neighborhood changed pretty quickly. Like, thank the Lord they built that. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm fascinated and haunted by the picture behind you there. Does anybody know where and when that picture of the shoreline was taken?
I took that photo, and I took that a couple of years ago, and that is at Point Clark. Yeah, Josh, the artistic director of Words, asked me, "Do you have any photos?" So I sent him a whole bunch. When I started looking, I realized I had hundreds, hundreds and hundreds. And I think it's that photo documentation is interesting because it comes up a lot in this book about photographs are a big part of, of our histories, and how we document and capture or try to freeze these moments.
Was my head an orb floating in the water when you went up there to take the picture? Mysterious orb. Right? You fear posted like sort of mythically along the top there. and
You
then
kind of
there's
look
me,
like you're
flat-
shouting,
Yeah.
a drowning almost.
But I'm also shouting in the wrong direction. Like, what am I over there? Anyway, are there any more questions before we liberate the room for the next panel? No? Well, I encourage everyone here to buy to buy the books. They are available up there, and I encourage you not only to buy them but to read them as well. As a used bookseller, many of the books I buy are practically unread. So I do encourage you to read the books by these three. You will be rewarded for the time, and let's give them a final round of applause. Well done.